this fight has cost me everything. In this moment, filled with doubt and shame, I've forgotten almost everything you promised
Well, good evening. Those of you watching us online and those of you here in the room, I know you came here thinking we were going to be continuing our study of the life of David. We have been going through the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel in the Old Testament, which happens to correspond to the life of Israel's arguably greatest king, probably Israel's greatest king, David. And we will continue that story next week. We're actually at a point in David's life where he makes one of the two biggest mistakes of his life, and it's just heartbreaking. And this is the day after the election, and frankly, I just didn't think you could take it. I didn't feel like we could take both of those in one day. So I'd actually, in all seriousness, I've had a lot of emails, a lot of calls about election-related issues, about anxiety, etc. And no, this is not going to be a county-by-county breakdown or anything. But I really do want to talk to you about Christian interaction in the public square. And here's my thesis. I'll tell you before we get started, the thesis of what I want to say is I think we as Christians need to do things differently going forward than we have done to get us here. And I'll tell you what I mean by that as time goes by. You can ask questions. Text your questions during class. We'll answer as many as we can fit in, and we have time, but there's the number. It's also on your handout if you'd like to ask questions. I'd like to start out simply by saying this. I believe when the votes are all counted, I will be president. I figure everybody else is claiming victory. I would just jump in before it's final as well, So in all seriousness, this has been a difficult election for America. And it's probably been record voter turnout. That's probably good for America since we live in a Republican system. Voting is important for us. But what I want to talk about is, okay, we voted. Now what? Well, as of the time of teaching this class, there's not a definitive answer to who's winning in the White House. There's still a few other races up for grabs, but you could summarize it at this point to say that it was not a good election for Democrats at the gubernatorial, senatorial, and congressional level, and this election has not, to this point anyway, gone the way the Republicans wanted for the White House. And so we'll see how it plays out. But my thesis is really going to go beyond that a little bit. Let me start by looking back at the past few days. I remember in 2016, we taught this series, and I remember people saying this is the most important election of our lives. And now in 2020, we said, this is the most important election of our lives. I'm going to go out on a limb and make a prediction about 2024. It will be the most important election of our lives. Now, I'm not trying to be facetious because there's some truth in that. Every one of these elections have huge consequences. So I do understand that. But I think the anxiety level and the partisanship level, as these things get whipped into a frenzy, haven't really done us very much good. And I think people had a hard time deciding how to vote. They had a hard time deciding, okay, what is going to be my criteria? Is it going to be my head? Is it going to be my heart? And I thought I would remind you of this great quote from one of our founders, is that the move between liberal and conservative ideas, traditionally between the head and the heart, is one that's been around for a long time. This election probably saw as many Christians as I've seen sit the election out. The problem with sitting the election out is, I'm going to go even further back in history, Plato is famous for saying this: one of the penalties for refusing to participate in politics is that you end up being governed by your inferiors. So it's tough to make the choice, and there are also consequences for sitting it out. The thing about our elections are and this is one of the things that I want to frame this discussion. Our elections are a binary choice. With all apologies to those of you who voted for Kanye West. I mean, I understand there were more than two choices, and actually there were several choices on the ballot, but realistically, we had a binary choice, and people struggled with that, largely because for a lot of Christians, neither one of these choices were really acceptable in some way or another to them. But you realize you get funneled into kind of a binary choice. That also happens in religion as well as politics. This is a slide I've shown you before, and I want to set up what I want to talk about in this way. Even in religion, you get this binary, this what is called the fallacy of the false dichotomy. Basically saying to someone, you can have this or you can have that. You can either agree with me or you can be racist. You can either agree with me or you can be a bad person. Or, we set up these false dichotomies. We do it in religion sometimes too, in the sense that sometimes we say what's most important in religion is truth. And truth without any temperance with compassion leads to a very condemning kind of religion, whatever religion it may be. I'm not just talking about Christianity. And then compassion without any temperance for truth or reality lends to enabling people. And both of these things lead to oppression. They just lead to oppression in different ways. So here's my point. Whether it's religion, which Jesus had a lot to say about the religion of his time, the truth of the Pharisees and the licentiousness of the Herodians, and basically the gospel finds itself here. I've shown you this before, but the cross of Christ is high truth and high compassion. The gospel of Jesus Christ doesn't fit very well in our dual categories. It doesn't fit very well in a Republican, Democratic category. It doesn't fit very well in it's all about truth, it's all about compassion category. The gospel won't be confined. We tend to, as Christians, experience a lot of distress when we try to live a Christ-like life, we live a gospel life. We try to live Ephesians 4:1, live in a manner worthy of your calling, and realize that we have tension. I know we don't necessarily articulate it this way, but you have tension when you realize, wait a minute, this life doesn't fit neatly in either one of these categories. And that's where I'd like to talk about a little bit different way forward. But first, let's talk about how Christians tend to solve that dilemma. I'm just framing this up. If you want to look at the Christian landscape, you want to look at the political landscape, you want to look at the really, honestly, more partisan hostility inside Christianity than I've ever seen in an election. And part of the problem is trying to get the gospel to fit into a category that it won't fit into. But here's how Christians have traditionally tried to approach politics, have tried to approach the categories of our world. Like a Democrat, Republican, the categories of you can either be compassionate toward immigrants or you can be a hate-filled person. I mean, the gospel doesn't want to fit in either one of these boxes. One of the ways Christians have tried to deal with this is to accommodate the culture. Try to shape the gospel to fit into a category. I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. Another way is to separate. In other words, remove oneself from the game. In other words, I can't play this game. I'm not willing to accommodate my faith and make it fit into any of these boxes entirely, so I want to separate. And so you see the church pulling back from the world, from the secular world. We don't participate in politics, or we simply want to go into our own enclaves and we want to move away from the world. The third way that we have not tried in America, in my view, is a subversive approach to this. And that is, we neither accommodate and fit our faith into it, nor do we separate from the world, but we engage the world in a very subversive way. And what I mean by that is we act in this system in a way that undercuts the system. My contention to you is this is a much more biblical model of how we act in the next 4 years in America. Let me just bring it all the way down to our particular case. As opposed to trying to figure out how do I separate from something I can't accept, or how do I accommodate something and shape my faith to fit it. So let me give you a couple examples of this. This is Tim Keller time. By the way, I want to quote several theologians here. I have a text that I'd like to look at, obviously from the scriptures, but there are a lot of theologians that have done a lot of thinking about this. What is our proper posture toward this? And let me reframe it. What alleviates the anxiety? We had a lot of anxiety 4 years ago. We have a lot of anxiety now. My prediction is the anxiety doesn't go away. It just keeps trending up. How do we check out of that anxious system by trying to either accommodate or separate from our culture? Here's Keller's analysis of the idea of accommodating. He said, those churches which we can, for the sake of convenience, call liberal churches, appeal to a section of modern culture that has three idols: personal choice and freedom, absolute tolerance and the rejection of any kind of exclusive truth and personal responsibility, and professional expertise and status. If you look at our culture, if you think about this, I know I'm going through this quickly, but if you think about this, there is a segment of our culture, there's a segment of our political culture that is embodied by those three things. That experts tell you how to run your life, there is no exclusive truth, and you are not personally responsible. You have been victimized in one way or another. And that personal choice and freedom, your ability to act as you wish, is absolute. There is a political and a cultural element that lives by those idols. Keller is exactly right. Well, churches that have chosen to accommodate that in order to attract this culture and avoid conflict, avoid anxiety, avoid tension, have adapted. They've accommodated. They accept modern sexual ethics. They do not do church discipline. They do not preach Christ as the only way to salvation. Their ministry is supportive and therapeutic. When I say therapeutic, I mean a Jesus that'll make your life better, right? So therapeutic, and no one is ever warned of the dangers of God's judgment. The church is run by experts, and the laity are not empowered to minister. In general, the popular opinions of modern culture are adopted and promoted. In other words, this is an accommodation. This is fitting your faith into a box. If churches preach judgment, accountability, and moral virtue as Jesus did, there would be conflict. And so accommodating is always, for Christians, it's true for other religions as well, but I want to focus on us, is always a way to alleviate conflict, anxiety, and tension. And one of the ways is I will conform my faith to the gods of the culture. Well, let's flip to the other side, because there are two ways churches do this. More conservative churches appeal to those political elements and cultural elements who idolize the past, the nuclear family, one's own race and traditional culture, and authority. While liberal culture is relativistic, conservative culture is moralistic and makes an idol out of goodness and respectability. I'll give you a great example of this, and I know some of these, by the way, if you don't get offended by something I say, this has been a really bad lesson, all right? So you should be offended at some point. But if you want to think about how our two political parties, I'm going to give you one simple example. How do they think about poverty? Well, on the one side, the more liberal, certainly the leftists, but more liberal political elements in our society think that you are a victim. Poverty is the result of oppression and people being made victims. The more conservative, certainly the far right side of our political spectrum, looks at poverty and said, you goofed up. You made poor choices. Now, the truth about poverty in our country, and one of the reasons that we've been at war with poverty, right? The Great Society, 1960s, Lyndon Johnson. How many years has that been? Do the quick math. Yes, about 60 years. We've been at war on poverty for 60 years, and we haven't defeated poverty. Why? Because we don't agree on the reasons for poverty. And it turns out that they're actually, both of those are to some extent, correct. So my point is, conservative culture makes an idol out of goodness, respectability, personal accountability. Conservative culture values unquestioning deference to leaders, tends to idealize the good old days, tends to feel superior in its view of its culture, tends to put so much emphasis on family life that singles and single parents feel like second-class citizens. If churches preached about racism, the need for justice for the poor, and challenged people to embrace the socially and morally unrespectable, as Jesus did, there would be conflict. Now, you're going to disagree with something on these two slides, but you get the point. The point is that accommodating the culture makes you shape your faith into a way that fits into one of those two choices, right? One of those false dichotomies. And when you do that, at least for the moment, you alleviate the tension, and you will see that in our religious culture. You see the idea of trying to accommodate. The second is separating. That is the famous separation of church and state. And so you can argue about whether the separation of church and state is a founding ideal of our nation. I would argue it is not. Nevertheless, whatever your opinion of that is one way to alleviate the tension as Christians trying to live a godly life come into conflict with the culture and the politics of the day. It's like, fine, you take care of the secular world, I'll take care of my religious life and my own moral life. And so we separate church and state. It's not just the secular world that adheres to this. Sometimes this is the way Christians want to handle this issue, is to separate the church from the state. Now, the difficulty with this is sometimes the political world is fine with this philosophy. They're fine with an accommodationist philosophy as long as you're willing to go the whole way, right? And identify yourself completely with a very liberal ideology or an extremely conservative ideology. They're also willing to go this way, but not in an impartial way. It's freedom to worship. You've probably heard that phrase before. That's not what this country was founded on, freedom to worship. It was also not founded on freedom from religion, which is how the doctrine of church and state has been interpreted in the past 40 or 50 years in terms of court rulings, is basically the secular world should be freed from religion. The separation of church and state that I think is envisioned in our country is the freedom of religion. It guarantees an impartial government posture to the public square, not a pushing out of religion in the public square. But that's not the way this separation is working in our society. So Christians that separate really struggle with relevance. You can get pushed into your churches on Sunday morning and keep it there. And the problem is, we as Christians want to alleviate the tension with our culture. On the other hand, we have this Great Commission. Mark Sayers makes this point really well when he says we cannot rely solely on the contemporary Western church's favored strategy of cultural relevance. Cultural relevance happens when you say, I'm going to separate because I just can't accommodate my faith to any of your categories, so you do your thing, I'll do my thing. But I somehow need to attract those lost people into the church. So what do? An endless quest for relevance. This is where the fog machine was born, right? Is light shows, fog machine, relevance. And Sayers accurately remarks this. He said, in which Christianity in the church is made relevant to secular Western culture. His argument is instead we need to rediscover gospel resilience. How do you engage in a way that is appealing to a culture from which you've separated yourself without adopting the forms of that culture? And so the church has struggled with accommodation, and the church has struggled with separation. The idea of subversion, now I want to move on to what I really want to talk to you about, is my argument is going to be that the biblical model is a subversive model. It neither accommodates the culture, nor does it separate from the culture. It also doesn't really suffer from high anxiety. When back in the day when Roman emperor died and there was a battle for, a civil war or a battle to see who would take over, Christians weren't saying, this is the most important civil war in our lifetime, because they knew however this turned out wasn't going to be favorable to them. And that really didn't cause them a lot of anxiety because their strategy was neither accommodation nor separation, it was subversion. Let me tell you what I mean by subversion. The fundamental idea of subversion is this: politics is not the only source of power in a society. If you remember in the study that we've been doing with David, we talked about how King Saul began to look for political solutions to the nation's problems. King David looked to God for the solutions to the nation's problems. Now, that's a simplistic view, but one of the things the church has kind of forgotten is that in the history of the church, the healthy history of the church, we have never relied on political solutions to achieve the mission of the church. The church has always understood, as Jesus understood. Jesus had no political power and changed the world completely. I mean, if you want to go to John 18 and look at the conversation, and I won't take time to do it here, between Jesus and Pontius Pilate. That is one of the most brilliant conversations in all the Bible. You get Jesus, who has all the power in the universe, who is completely powerless in front of Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate says, I have the power of life and death over you, and in the end, Pontius Pilate will die of suicide, and Jesus will be raised from the dead. It's a total role reversal. Jesus understood that politics is not the only source of power in a society. Let me give you another quote. And then this is interesting. Stanley Hauerwas thought a lot about this question. He said, the church does not exist to provide an ethos for democracy or any other form of social organization. What does he mean by that? What he means is the church is not here to accommodate the gospel to even the best form of government out there. You know, as Winston Churchill famously said, democracy is the worst form of government in the world, except for all the others, right? Democracy is the best of the lot. And what Hauerwas is saying, no matter how good it may seem, the church does not exist to engage and align with any ethos or any other form of social organization, but stands as a political, listen to this language, he gets the Bible exactly right, stands as a political alternative to every nation, witnessing to the kind of social life that is possible for those that have been formed by the story of Christ. What's he saying? He's saying that the church is, because of what you believe, you are inherently an alternative society, an alternative community to every form of government out there. You are not Democrats or Republicans. Oh, we have a system in which you have to register as one in order to be able to vote. You went and you made a mark, Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever. You picked a candidate. But that does not, that's simply adhering to the forms of our system. Just like when you go to get a driver's license, you fill out the forms, etc. It doesn't define you, doesn't define your choices. That's just how you operate in this system. What Hauerwas is saying is actually you're neither a Democrat nor Republican, nor independent. We, as Christ's followers, are defining a completely different kind of society. That's a subversive idea. That was very subversive to the Romans. If you think about the history of the church, I'll give you an ancient and a modern description. The ancient church was persecuted heavily by the Jews until about 95 AD. And then the Romans took notice and they ramped it up a whole other level. And so from about the time of Domitian in 95, I'm painting with a broad brush here. So all of you historians, relax. I just want to make the point. Okay, so from about 95 until Constantine issued the Edict of Toleration, meaning, okay, we're going to quit persecuting Christians. You've got a little over 200 years where it wasn't legal to be Christian, and Christians died by the tens of thousands just for being Christians. They had zero political power. There was never a movement in the church that said, let's get the pickups, everybody get your hunting rifle, and we're just going to change this situation. And yet, what happens in 310 AD? Christianity ends up becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. You can't stamp it out. In fact, it wins. How? Because there are other forms of power besides political power in a society. That was very subversive. If you want to think about it in this way, and this is not a bad way to think about it, Christianity conquered the Roman Empire. I don't mean conquered it as in got rid of its boundaries and killed its leaders and took over the government. What it did was it undermined the legitimacy, and so many people became Christians that it became the religion of the Roman Empire. So clearly, politics is not the only source of power. How did they do that? They did it by living out the story of Christ as though it were true. That's my condemnation of us to some extent. Sometimes we fail, I fail, to live out what I believe is true. And I'm tempted instead to say, if enough of us vote this way, we can kind of get what we want. I'm not telling you that voting is unimportant. I'm not telling you that politics can't be a useful tool to get what we want. I'm just saying it's a terrible master. It's a terrible thing to lean on. And so the early church overcame Rome by being that kind of society that was completely different. It rejected all the Roman political categories. It rejected all the Roman social categories. They rejected the Roman gods. They rejected the Roman customs, the ones that were immoral, and they rejected the emperor. They served the emperor. They just didn't bow down to the emperor. Same thing's happening today. Think about the church in China. Church in China has zero political power. In fact, the church in China is persecuted. People are killed on a fairly routine basis. Churches are burned down. Congregations are broken up because they have too many people. Every now and then, for about a decade, you have to go underground and secretly meet in houses. That's the church, very much like the first century church. And yet, and here's the interesting thing, Christianity is growing in China. Why? Because politics is not the only source of power in a society. Christians are subversive. They're answering the fundamental questions that people have in a way that is different than any political party answers those questions, different than any form of government, and different than any cultural model answers those questions. How did they do it? Acts 2:42, this is kind of my basic text. I really want to use this to launch into how then should we do things differently going forward. We voted, now what? And this is a now what that doesn't really require any particular outcome. This works no matter what. Well, here's what the disciples did. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. In other words, they studied their Bibles. That would be the modern equivalent. They wanted to know, who is Jesus? What did he say? How do we live? What does it look like to be a follower of Jesus Christ? That's what they spent their time doing. To the fellowship, they had tremendous, this is something we don't talk about enough, allegiance and loyalty to one another. As much allegiance and loyalty as you have to your biological brothers and sisters, some of you are going, you do not know my brothers and sisters. Yeah, think about, though, the basic model. You would do almost anything for your family. That's the allegiance that they had for each other. They understood each other as family. To the breaking of bread, the breaking of bread is talking about table fellowship. We spend time together. We eat together. We perform, we do, this is the modern Christian word, we do life together, except we really do life together. We don't just Zoom life together. And to prayer. In other words, they've got the horizontal relationship with other believers. We break bread together. And the vertical relationship with God. And we spend time in prayer. That's what they did. They had no fog machines. Okay, I'm not really all that down on fog machines, but it's just kind of my model for basically relevant Christianity. All right, so they didn't have fog machines. They didn't have big events. They didn't have any of these things, and they grew unbelievably. They had zero political power at all. The Jews were already starting to persecute them by this time. So they have no political power, and yet they're growing like crazy. Why? This model of doing community is extremely appealing to people because it answers some of the deepest needs people have. Everyone was filled with awe. Many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. Selling their possessions and goods, they gave to anyone as he has need. We do this too, and I'm not making an apologetic, but we tithe, and we take care of each other, and then I'm going to just stop there. We also care for, show compassion for people who aren't believers. But for the purpose of this discussion, I'm talking about how then shall we live. So I'm just going to cut it off right there. We do this too. You just don't think about it in that way. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes, ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number, that's key, the Lord added to their number. Were they chasing relevance? They did not care about relevance. Love is always relevant. Family is always relevant. People look at that and they go, that's something I want to be a part of, whether it's relevant or not. So they weren't chasing relevance. They said, the Lord will bring to us those who are being saved. And so that's the model of that early community. I simply want us to follow that model. They weren't accommodating the culture. They weren't separating from the culture. They were living as an authentic community of believers in a way that was completely subversive. They answered, and you and I answer, all the big questions of life differently than the average Republican, differently than the average Democrat. Because we're Christ followers, we are modeling a completely different way of living. So let's talk about that a little bit more. The allegiance that they had to each other, the unity that they had around the truth, and then the living out in a compassionate way towards one another. It turned out that the gospel exploded, even under oppression, because of this living out the reality of who they were and what they did. Miroslav Volf says it this way: the prophetic role of Christian communities, their engagement to mend the world, to foster human flourishing, and to serve the common good, is nothing but their identity projecting itself outward in word and deed. Okay, so what does that actually mean? What he's saying is any effect that we have on the outside world is not because we're trying to be relevant. It's not because we're trying to fit into a Republican Party or Democrat, and I'm not picking on either one. I'm just using them as two different political ideologies. There's more than two political ideologies in our country, but those are just two easy ones. We're not going to affect the world by doing that. We're going to affect the world by living out Acts 2:42, meaning being who we are. We are projecting our identity outward in word and deed. Does that make sense? This is really well said. He said, you want to know how to reduce the tension? Don't worry about accommodating. Don't worry about separating. Don't really worry about who wins the election. Oh, by all means, if you can vote, vote. If you live in North Korea, don't vote. You know, bottom line is, this is not your source of anxiety at all. At the end of the day, go be who you're called to be as a subversive community of believers, and that identity will affect the world. Well, he's historically correct in that regard. It's happening in China right now because all they can do is live out their community of belief. Like, I believe what Jesus said was true, and I'm going to live like it. And everybody goes, whoa, that's really different. You don't seem to buy into much of any of this. I can't classify you. That's good. Hauerwas says it this way: the first task of Christian social ethics, once again, same as Wolf, he's saying, if you want to affect the world. Remember, Wolf said, if you want to affect the world, be who you are. And that identity will project itself out in word and deed. In other words, being who you are will affect the world. It's not up to you. Hauerwas is going to say the same thing. First task of Christian social ethics, in other words, if you want to do some social good, is not to make the world better or more just. Think about that. Trying to make the world better or more just is a fool's errand, and all you will get is frustrated. It's like my grandfather said, grew up on a farm, and so we'd feed the pigs, feed the hogs, and so sometimes I would play with the little piglets. You know, as a kid, you let them play with the piglets. Is this resonating with anybody? You're like, the agrarian thing doesn't work for me, Terry. Okay, well, anyway, you can at least gather this. So, man, I get in there and I come out, I'm covered with mud, you know? And so what was his favorite saying to me? And that is that when you wrestle with the pig, you're going to come out with mud. You are not going to make the pig clean. You're the one who's going to come out covered in mud. That's what he's saying. He said, look, the goal of a Christian social ethic isn't to make the world better or more just, but to help Christian people, us, to form their community. In other words, let's live our lives together, Acts 2:42, consistent with our belief, our conviction that the story of Christ is a truthful account of our existence. So that's just a fancy way of saying, live like you believe the Bible is true. Live like you believe that what Jesus said is actually true. You will not die forever. You will live forever. Nothing can overcome you. Your body can be killed, but you can never be defeated. That in actuality, love is more powerful than revenge. That politics is short-term temporal power. Truth is what really matters. All of these things, live like you believe it's true. That's how you're going to influence the world. That's how we're going to affect the world. Well, you notice I'm getting far afield, and this sounds a little philosophical, but I really want to bring it down to reality. And you think to yourself, that's why the scripture talks so much about Jesus saying in John 9, if you want to come after me, if you want to be like me, take up your cross daily, deny yourself, and follow me. What's he saying? He's saying, in the context of what I'm saying is, you can just leave your voting card on the table, and you can deny all the things you're counting on, your 401k. Not saying you give it up, it's saying that's not what I'm counting on. My vote is not what I'm counting on. You're what I'm counting on, so I'll take this cross and I'll follow you. See what I'm saying? This comes down to actually living out what we believe. I'm going to argue that not only does that affect the world, because let's face it, our witness isn't particularly good right now. Christians like to talk about our witness. No Christians have good witness right now because we've been too busy accommodating, too busy separating. And when you do that, you just look like everybody else. This idea of a subversive way of living actually affects the world more. And the second thing it does is you don't have to live with all the anxiety of trying to fit in. You just go be who you authentically are as a Christ follower. I want to talk about this idea then of how do you move forward? How do we actually live this out? So that's great, Terry. So I understand what you're saying is I can check out of worrying about this election. I could maybe rejoice saying, oh, that candidate won. I think that that's going to help more people than the other candidate, whichever one you happen to believe. I'm not picking sides here. I'm just saying you really don't have to worry about that. You're like, oh, it might be nice, but I wasn't counting on that. You know, that's not where your anxiety lies. We're going to go live out our authentic lives as Christ followers regardless. If you can do it in China and you can do it in North Korea, you can certainly do it in the United States of America. We're going to go make the world a better place, but we're not going to try to make the world a better place. We're just going to go live as who we are, and God will use that. Our identity will project onto this culture. Trying to meddle in this culture has not helped us much. Again, the war on poverty has been going on for 60 years and we still have poverty. Why? Because we've been trying to use political mechanisms to do it. Can they be helpful? Yeah, they can be helpful, but they're not the ultimate solution. Our identity and our way of life is the ultimate solution. Yeah, and I realize if you're sitting there thinking, I'm a little uncomfortable, this sounds really very philosophical. No, this comes down to simply this. Do you believe Jesus is who he said he is, and are you willing to live in accordance with it? I mean, that's really what it comes down to, and that's the question Jesus asked. When he says we're saved by grace through faith, that's not mental assent. He says, do you trust that everything I said is true, and are you willing to take up your cross and live like you believe it? That's what he's saying. When it says you're saved by grace through faith, what it means is this is what salvation is I actually believe what you were saying. I absolutely trust you. Consequently, I have unquestioning loyalty and obedience to these, my brothers and sisters, and we're going to go do your work in the world, and you can take care of making the world a better place. And he will. It comes down to just that thing. Now, how's this going to work? The problem if you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you're a secular humanist, you're a leftist, you're a Marxist, you're whatever you are, whatever your ideology might be, the big problem is it's not true. Therefore, it doesn't solve the basic problems of humanity. Can it be partly true? Sure. But there are cracks in every ideology. There are big holes, and people trying to live out this ideology experience these cracks in the ideology as anxiety and tension and unresolved conflict. Let me give you an example of this. So we live in the most technologically advanced nation in the world. The poorest people in America live better than the kings and queens of 150 years ago. That's just true. Healthcare's better, whatever. I'm not saying that poorest people are getting fair treatment or good treatment. That's not my point at all. We do have issues. Set that aside for a second. The point I'm trying to make is we live in the most technologically advanced nation the world has ever known. Not in the world today, in all of history, in all of time. Your healthcare is better than anybody, anywhere. Your affluence is better than anybody, everywhere. You have more free time than anybody, everywhere, in any time in history. And yet, anxiety levels now are through the roof. Depression is through the roof. Suicides are through the roof. What in the world is going on? I'll tell you what's going on. Those ideologies do not answer the fundamental questions, and you're still left with the anxiety and the depression of saying, what does this all mean? Who am I, and what is the point of this? Keller says it this way. He says it well. Strict secularism, that's that whole suite of things that I was telling you about. Secularism includes humanism, Marxism, capitalism, includes all of those ideas. Holds that people are physical entities without souls, and when your loved ones die, they simply cease to exist. Do you know how absolutely existentially unsatisfying that is? I mean, I want you to stop and think about it, because I became a Christian a little bit later in life, and so I was perfectly comfortable with the whole cease to exist thing until my dog died. And then I realized, wait, this ideology stinks. You know, I'm joking a little, but my point is, how do you deal with loved ones dying? How do you deal with ultimate separation? It causes people a lot of problems, and he's pointing this out, that sensations of love and beauty are just neurological chemical events. There is no right or wrong outside of what we determine and choose. Those are secular ideas. Those are prevalent ideas in our culture. Those positions are at the very least deeply counterintuitive. In other words, nobody actually believes this. For almost all people, and large swaths of humanity will simply continue to reject them as impossible to believe. And here's the problem. They think they're scientific, and they can't live with the implications of that. They think they're evolutionists, and you can't live with the implications of that. Do you understand what I'm saying? The people that you know that are secularists, those people are really struggling. They stay, you know what they do? They stay really busy. Why do they stay so busy? So they don't have to think about the ultimate things. Because if I am the product of chance and I mean nothing, that means my life means nothing. It means my wife's life means nothing. My kids' lives mean nothing. And when I die, I just go away. Have you ever been to a funeral for people that aren't Christian? You probably have. Have you ever noticed, and I don't mean this to be disrespectful, but if it is, it is. But my point is that have you ever noticed how hard they try to hold on to some meaning? You know why they're doing that? I sometimes want to stand up and say, hey, you are a hypocrite. You're an evolutionist. Just put this guy in the ground and move on. Circle of life, Lion King, come on. But what do? We want to say, you're going to live on in my heart forever. No, they're not. That's just biochemical reactions called grief. Okay, I know I'm being a little harsh, but my point is, if you believe that stuff, you really have a problem. And that's what Keller is saying. This is probably one of the best pictures that I've seen in a long time. Our political system, a large swath of it, are the children of this idea. This is existentialist, postmodern thinking. It undergirds much of the liberal thought in our country. The meaning of life is to find some meaning in life. When you think about that for a minute and you think, do you want to live like that? The only meaning in life is just whatever I can happen to find. That's what your neighbors think. This is the ultimate despair of all those other ideologies. That's why you can't mold Christianity to fit it in any of these boxes. Christianity doesn't have big holes in the dike. It doesn't have big cracks. Living out an authentic life, you don't struggle when you go to the funeral of a Christian. You don't struggle in this family of believers. Oh, we have grief, we have joy, we have all the emotions of life, but you don't ever despair. You don't ever feel hopeless. You don't ever feel like what I've believed about life it's just failed me. It's not true at all. You don't have that feeling. And all the people that you know that aren't Christ followers ultimately have this. And if you look at the stats in our society, that's why. It just comes down to what are the answers to the deepest problems for human beings. James K. Smith kind of makes this observation. Another theologian thought a lot about this. It's not enough to ask how we got permission to stop believing in God. Now he's talking about our culture. He says we need to also inquire about what emerged to replace belief in God. Remember, America's called a post-Christian nation. What does that mean? Is we used to be mostly Christians who believed that the things that the Bible said were basically true, right? Now we have everybody who tells pollsters they're a Christian and don't believe that anything the Bible says is true. Consequently, all the stats that I just talked to you about, we're a post-Christian nation. We have moved beyond Christianity to what? Some secular ideology. That's what Smith is saying. We didn't just stop believing in God. Your neighbors didn't just stop being Christian. They started being something else. It's not enough that our secular age is in an age of disbelief. It's an age of believing otherwise. This is what makes Christianity subversive. It's not a matter of, you're a Christian, I'm not. Nobody's not. Everybody's something. Everybody has faith in something. You don't know anyone who lives a life, I'm scientific, I only follow science. Oh, you liar. That is so untrue. Because science doesn't have the answer to all the big problems in life. You have faith in a lot of things. Everybody has faith. Everybody believes in something, and that's what Smith's pointing out. He says we can't tolerate living in a world without meaning. So if the transcendence that previously gave significance to the world is lost, in other words, without a God to explain where did you come from, why are you here, do you matter, and where are you going? If you don't have a God to answer those questions, you have to answer those questions somehow. A new imaginary, a new ideology that enables us to imagine a meaningful life within this now self-sufficient universe of gas and fire. This is the key to how we change the world. It's not from accommodating, it's not from separating, it's not for getting your guy or girl to be president. It is saying, all of you people believe something, I'm going to show you what I believe. That's Acts 2:42. The Christian said, let me just show you what I believe. There are no cracks in this. I know where I came from. I know that I have value. I know where I'm going to, and I know what my God asks me to do as far as you, to love you, not kill you, to forgive you, not condemn you. I'm here to speak truth to you and invite you by the grace of my God to come join this community. If you would prefer to stay out there and follow your beliefs, you can. Christianity is not a militant religion. We don't make people become Christians. In fact, you can't make people become Christians. So what Smith is arguing out of this is the effectiveness of living an authentic Christian life is not that, well, they're not Christians, I need to make them become Christians. No, they're just, actually the technical word for this is they're pagans. Now that sounds derogatory, I don't mean it to be derogatory. What I mean is they just have another religion. It just isn't Christianity. And so how would you then want to interact with that? Well, I'll just put my beliefs into action. You go put your beliefs into action and let's just see. What do you want to be? That's what Acts 2:42 is doing. That's what the early church was doing. That's what the church in China is doing. They don't have the luxury of political power. They just got to go be Christians in a very unfriendly environment, and they're growing like crazy. Why? Because it's true. Question.
So would you agree that it is actually harder to truly live by faith in America than it is in China or North Korea or another oppressive regime where Christianity is growing?
That is a great question that I wish you hadn't asked because, the answer is not one that I like, and it's not one that you're going to like. But historically speaking, and this is going to sound counterintuitive to you, persecution and oppression has been better for the faithful witness of the church than prosperity. I'm not saying that I would like to have prosperity. I'd like to have religious freedom. I would like to not have somebody confiscating your goods or putting you in jail because you won't bake a cake or you won't do, whatever it is. I would rather live like that, but I have to say, historically speaking, the church has done better in its faithful following of Christ in persecution than it has in prosperity. That's unfortunate, but it's true. And I'll go even further and I will say that as a historian, if you look at the church from time to time, as the church, as it will, as we as individuals, as we will, drift away from an authentic life following Christ, as individuals, what does God do? He says, I want to follow you. And he says, I know, and you have some sin that's drifting. John 15, I'm the vine, you're the branches. My Father prunes the sin out of your life. I pray for that. David prayed for that. Search me, O God, and see if there is any untoward way in me. If there is any sin in me, and if so, cut it out. It's not fun, but we pray that prayer, don't we? It's like, I'm your man, I'm your woman. So let's get rid of this sin. He prunes us because he loves us. He prunes his church through persecution, because then you find out who actually believes. And that's something God does, not something I do. I'm not judging people. That's something that the Holy Spirit does historically. So that time is coming, but I'm not here to be gloom and doom and tell you I know when that time is coming, but I believe that historically speaking, it will happen.
And do you believe at that time that Christianity will become illegal again?
Do I believe at that time Christianity will become illegal again? I'm going to give you an opinion now. It's an opinion based on what I read in the scripture. I'm just not going to tell you that there's a verse that says this is exactly what will happen. If you look at history and you look at the book of Revelation, which is, depending on your view of Revelation, I would argue Revelation is happening and will happen. Some people say it will happen, but it's not currently happening. Fine. Either way, when you look at how the church undergoes persecution, it starts economically. That has been true historically as well, is that it's harder to get a job as a Christian. It's harder to keep your job as a Christian. Now, some of you, the bells are going off saying, hey, wait a minute. If you cross this culture, you can lose your job. You can get fired for saying the wrong thing. You can get fired for posting the wrong thing on Facebook. Those are economic things. Make sense? It's not necessarily derived just at Christians at this point. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying persecution comes through economic factors first. That's just the model that I see. That's my opinion as to how it will happen. I'm not a prophet to tell you what's going to happen next year, 5 years from now. But the biblical model is it comes, first of all, with economic persecution, and it comes with vindication and justification. In other words, the people that do this think they are doing something morally good. Do you understand that? That ought to be sending some bells off in your head too. It's not like we hate these Christians, they're just bad people. Nobody's ever thought the Christians were all that bad of people. It's like these Christians are immoral people. In the early Roman Empire, I know this is going to sound crazy to you because we are not immoral people. Do we sin? Yes. But in general, does Jesus Christ say, go kill people, go do real immoral things? No. That's really not ever been the issue with Christianity. The issue for them, they thought they were immoral because they wouldn't worship the gods that the Romans worshiped. Oh, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Is when you don't worship the gods of the culture, then you become morally bad. And so it'll be economic persecution, then it'll be moral condemnation, and then I think it will be physical. I mean, ideologies like the ideologies we're talking about always lead to violence. They lead to authoritarianism and violence. That's just secular history. There's never been an ideology like Marxism, like socialism, like Nazism, we put names on these ideologies. And I'm not saying we have that in the United States, but we do have ideologies that have a very authoritarian flair to them. Those kinds of ideologies always end in physical oppression. So I would expect it to follow that path. That's an opinion. You may disagree and you may be right.
So what should our response be when we bump into the culture, whether that's a legal claim through a business, as you mentioned, or a moral claim that strikes our children through transgenderism or other things, what should our response be?
Yeah, that's a really good question because it kind of gets down to where the rubber meets the road. It's like Monday through Friday when I come in conflict, and it's like, I believe this and I don't believe that. How do I work? I actually want to turn it around. And I want to look at it, and I want to urge you to look at it from a different point of view. I don't want you to think about, I am reacting to a cultural mandate. I want you to think about, what does it look like to live like a Christ follower in this situation? Does that make sense? That's an important distinction. It's not, okay, I'm a Christian, and you're telling me I got to wear a mask, or you're telling me I got to do this, or you're telling me I got to do that. So do I really have to do it? That's a very reactive mindset. What I'd rather us say is, I'm a Christ follower, how do I engage with this? Well, Romans 13 says, my default setting is to be a good citizen and follow the guidance of the authorities. Now, when it comes to bowing down, when it comes to saying things that aren't true, when it comes to certain key things the Scripture talks about, then it's like, well, as a Christ follower, I got to say this, or I have to do this. I remember talking to David Prater one time. This is a great example, because this is going to sound crazy, but this was like this might have been 8 years ago. Anyway, there was talk at the time, if you remember, about potentially making it illegal to aid someone who was in this country illegally. We've changed all our terminology. So what it would basically be is you can't give food or help to someone who's undocumented. That'd be our current terminology to it. I know that sounds a little crazy, but actually there was thought to that law. And so we were talking about it, and it's not so much that if that law passed, he would say, and he just immediately agreed with this, he's not so much he's saying, how do I react to that law? What he said was, well, I don't know, but if somebody knocks at my door and they need help, I'm going to help them. You see what I'm saying? It's not, I'm going to go out there and say, oh yeah, let me show you. I'm not going to react to it. I'm just going to go be who I am. And if that lands me in jail, it lands me in jail. I mean, I'm taking a little bit of an extreme case, but that was a literal possibility. And so it wasn't so much, I'm just going to stand up and say, I will not follow that law. It's like, no, my default setting is to follow the laws. But if somebody comes and needs help, well, I'm a Christ follower, I'm going to help them. Does that make sense? I want you to turn it around and think, okay, what do I do as a Christ follower? And just remember that we typically are good citizens because our default position is Romans 13, is obey. Well, I don't like that law. I know. So obey. Well, that's confiscatory. That's wealth redistribution. That's too much taxes. Yeah, well, but obey the law. You see what I'm saying? Bow down to Caesar. As a Christ follower, I just can't do that. Does that make sense? So I want to turn it around and say, try to act authentically as a Christ follower in every situation. And surprisingly, it's not that hard to be a reasonably good citizen until the oppressive demands come. Okay? Well, let me finish this up because we're about out of time. I hope that this has been useful in making us think, because what I'd like to do, here are my basic points. For 4 years, we've been living with a lot of division and tension engaging in our political process. We're currently undergoing nail-biting tension to find out who won, The answer to that is the attorneys won. Okay, that's just always the answer, everything the attorney. That's a joke. Well, no, it's actually kind of true, but I still love you attorneys. But what I'm saying is we can continue down that road of accommodation or separation or trying to solve our problems through political means if we want to, and we're going to keep getting what we've always gotten, a whole lot of anxiety and a whole lot of conflict. Or we can say, you know what, I just think I want to check out of that whole system and I want to go do Acts 2:42. I just want to live like I believe this is true. And if that causes conflict, at least it's clean conflict. I have no anxiety about it. I have a clean conscience. I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. And I'm not going to spend my day thinking, oh my gosh, so-and-so's in the White House. Bad things are going to happen. Let me just assure you, bad things are going to happen, okay? No matter what. So why don't we just move past that and let's focus on living authentic lives as Christians. And here's probably, this is a quote too, is that the point is that's going to have a bigger impact on our society than any political solution will have, because we're going to trust in the Holy Spirit and God to bring those who are appointed for salvation. So I want you to live with this verse. So be Acts 2:42 and believe this is true. Do not be so worried about things, but in every situation, with prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God that transcends all understanding, that doesn't participate in the systems of the world, will guard your hearts and minds in Jesus Christ. You don't have to run in the rat race. I know that sounds like a duh statement, but we act like we have to. Well, everybody's concerned about politics. Everything's political. You don't have to think that way. You don't have to participate in that system. Why don't you just check out? And let's just go live as an authentic Christ-following community, and let's leave the anxiety up to God. If that sounds like a Pollyanna solution, here's my challenge. Try it 30 days risk-free. You come back in 30 days and don't say, I have way less stress. I will give you your money back, okay? Just return the unused portion, right? Seriously, next week, back to David. Things get ugly. You need to practice this between now and next week. I'll see you guys later.
Let's continue to sing together tonight. Come on. When night is falling and fear is calling, and still you're calling me. When faith is lost, my hope exhausted, you will be my strength. When my mind says I'm not good enough, God, you're enough for me. I've decided I'm not giving up, 'cause you won't give up on me, 'cause you won't give up on me, 'cause your love is holding on and it won't let go. I feel it breaking out like an echo, 'cause your love is holding on and it won't let go. I feel it breaking out like an echo in my soul. In every season, you keep repeating promises to me. Now there's no stopping when you have started until it is complete. 'Cause when my mind says I'm not good enough, God, you're enough for me. I've decided I'm not giving up. You won't give up on me, 'cause you won't
raising up the broken to life.
Caught up in this holy moment, I never want to leave. Oh, I'm not here for blessings. Jesus, you don't owe me anything, and more than anything that you can do, I just want you. I will delight in the song that you sing. Your grace, a melody, it covers everything. All of my stains, you've washed them away. You're calling me your own. Now teach my heart to know your grace is good. I don't deserve it. You gave your life when I wasn't worth it. You rescued me out of the darkness. Oh, your grace is good. Will you delight in the song that I sing? My praise and melody, all glory to the King. Your grace is enough, sufficient for me. You have covered all my wrongs. In my weakness, you are strong. Your grace is good. I don't deserve it. You gave your life when I wasn't worth it. You rescued me out of the darkness. Oh, your grace is good. So good. Oh. Without your grace, I'd be crippled with shame. Because of your blood, I'm no longer the same. And once I was dead, now you've given me life. Oh, your grace has saved me. Without your grace, I'd be crippled with shame. Because of your blood, I'm no longer the same. Once I was dead, now you've given me life. Oh, your grace has saved me. And without your grace, I Christ.